So as the Cold War recedes into the past and the confidential documents that escaped the shredders for a decade ago came to light, some of the most persistent and even pretentious myths of the Cold War would be justified or debunked. The latest revelations from the Gorak archives, which hold the documents of the Stasi and the East German secret police, suggest that the Stasi supported, funded, and even trained neo-Nazi groups in West Germany, and even had a resurgence of neo-Nazis of their own when the migrant workers from Angola to Vietnam came. Anyway, mostly on the West. Let's go. So it began with the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 when the Stasi mounted Operation Forget Me Not to flood the Federal Republic or the West Germans with chainmail and hate mail intended to provoke panic about a re-emergence of anti-Semitism and Nazism. Bonn was obligated to issue denials and even denounce these as fake, of course. Meanwhile, Stasi agents penetrated neo-Nazi parties in the West and, according to one former officer, ensure that the activities of the far right were always pointed in the correct direction and never against East Germany. Yeah? So one of the most notorious neo-Nazi workers and networks was the Hoffman Combat Sports Group, or the HCSG, and was enabled by the Stasi to train with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, in Lebanon. Exactly like the Red Army faction or the Rote Armee faction or the Bradan Meinhof gang of the far left and the third wave of terrorism or the New Left terrorism, which was also manipulated and sponsored by the Stasi. And just as the massacre of the Israeli athletes by the Palestinians of the 1972 Munich Olympics was justified by left-wing terrorists such as Ulrich Meinhof, who hated Zionism, with all the vitriol and all the violence that it came with Nazi and anti-Semitism. So the Hoffman Group actually justified the murder of a Jewish publisher in 1982. So the tactical aim of the neo-Nazi exercise was to destabilize and discredit West Germany, already saturated with disinformation designed to reinforce the impression that the new far-right cadres were being indoctrinated by the unrepented ex-Nazis of West Germany. Ex-Nazis, right? Ex-Nazis, Nazis, whatever. Preying on the post-war skeptical generation which was vulnerable to such propaganda, as demonstrated by the situation and highly successful operation to infiltrate and manipulate far-left student groups and agitators and terrorists in West Germany, such as the RAF and the Hoffman Group. The Stasi created periodic outbreaks of mass hysteria in the Bonn Republic from 1960 to 1980. The grand strategy laid behind the adoption of such cynical tactics. So by the mid-1950s, the Federal Republic, or West Germany, was already embarking on a program of rearmament under pressure from their NATO allies. Post-war Chancellor Konrad Adenauer even hoped to acquire a nuclear deterrent for the East. Thanks to the economic minister Ludwig Anhal's repeal of economic restraint and restriction, his famous bonfire of control, and the strong demand, an unbridgeable gap was opening between the capitalist West and the communist East. Exposing the latter poverty and lies, by 1953 East Berlin workers had actually begun an uprising. So the 1953 East Berlin workers' uprising, crushed only with the help of Russian tanks, had demonstrated the weakness of the Socialist Unity Party under Walter Ulbricht. Its leader's first reaction was to pack their bags straight for Moscow. As if things went tits up, I'd rather be in Kaliningrad. Thus undermining the Germany of Adenauer and Erhard by encouraging the young to seek a crypto-Nazi state was vital, not just to divide and conquer the West, but also to shore up the crumbling East and be like, we might be communists, but at least we're not Nazis. Yeah? Right? Right? The Stasi increasingly added its familiar role of suppression in the East and subversion in the West. The threat of a neo-Nazi revival would help the West German left whose goal was the German neutrality, which would wreck NATO would wreck a bit, but not completely destroy it, but would be a front loss. East Berlin could only justify its own totalitarianism by provoking similar measures by Bonn. The Berlin Wall was ultimately the symbol of communist repression, but was officially known as the Anti-Fascist Protection Barrier, or the Anti-Faction Protection Barrier. So the background of the most depraved and the most sadistic and the most successful of all Stasi campaigns is, indeed, the inferiority complex of East Germany and the East German regime. So by the 1940s, its leader Walter Ulbricht and Erich Honecker claimed that the West Germans and their West German rivals were really the front for fascist revisionism and fascist revanchism, or fascist revival. In league with American imperialists, they thereby remain faithful disciples to Joseph Stalin, who still love him even decades after he has died and was stored in a mausoleum forever. They're chilling. Stalin had never really trusted Winston Churchill or Franklin D. Roosevelt, and saw the wartime alliance as purely a coincidence and, better than being under Nazi rule, right? But he still saw the wartime alliance with them as a form of false consciousness and seized every scrap of evidence for his morbid speculation that the West would actually make peace with Hitler in order to turn on the communists and the Soviet Union, which obviously did not happen. This fantasy persisted even after 1945, whereas the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, was led by communists who had been exiled or imprisoned by Hitler, and some even killed. The Federal Republic was depicted in the Stasi 1965 Brandbuch as a kind of Fourth Reich, ran by the ex-Nazis and were bent on revenge against the Soviet Union and their Warsaw Pact allies. The fiction actually resented and was really flimsy and even circumstantial evidence that never really came to be. There was the selective rehabilitation of former Nazis by the Federal Republic of Germany, though. Even its founding father, Chancellor Adenauer, chose his far right-hand man, Dr. Hans Globig, who had written the official commentary on Hitler's 1935 Nuremberg arrest laws, while Kurt Kirchner, Chancellor from 1966 to 1969, had been a Nazi Party member. Not so nice, but it's a really interesting topic, and I might go into it in more depth. But if you wanted to work and, wanted to actually provide a living for a family, because you never know how the war would turn out. Hindsight is 2020, but who knows, right? And I mean, it was kind of forced too. But it's a very touchy subject, and I have to go into more detail than basic off-the-wall commentary, right, guys? There was the Bonn government refusal to recognize Germany's new eastern borders, thereby appeasing the 15 million Germans who had been expelled from their lands, which is now in Eastern Europe, but postponing indefinitely any actions to recover the lost territory. And there was even the sinister image of the West German secret services and secret police, in which a prominent role was played by such dubious figures such as General Reinhard Gillan, who had previously run the Nazi intelligence on the Eastern Front and even the Gestapo at home, and Herbert Strasserer, a former and Herbert Schruber, a former Nazi prosecuting attorney. None of this, of course, added up to the Nazi conspiracy, as most Nazis kind of had to be rehabilitated in the new West German state. Look at Operation Paperclip or one of von Braun's plans in the Soviet Union. So let's not play suspicious, guys. The irony of the East now was the irony that there were. So the irony is that there were, of course, huge numbers of former Nazis in senior positions in the GDR as well, or the Deutsches Demokratische Republik, or the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. And ample evidence exists that anti-Semitism permeated by the communist hierarchy as well, as Russia had a long-standing hatred of Jews and even joined in on the anti-Jewish bandwagon and even were partners with Hitler. So, you know, Honecker liked to promote blonde and blue-eyed people and Aryan types, and a Jewish background was always a potential fatal hindrance to his Aryan master communist race. Even more ironic was that the man who appeared to have bore the primary responsibility of supporting neo-Nazis was actually half Jewish himself. The head of the Stasi Foreign Intelligence, not the secret police, but the Foreign Intelligence Agency now. There were like three Stasis: internal, West German, and international, right? So the head of the Stasi Foreign Intelligence throughout the period of Marcus Wolf, who since 1989 had basked in notoriety and endlessly featured in Western media as this super Stasi spy. The son of Friedrich Wolf, a celebrated communist writer and Jew, Wolf made much of his 1997 memoirs as the man without a face of his Jewish background as a factor for his political formation. He also made one core reference to the neo-Nazi disinformation campaign. Emanating from the Stasi, only to assure the reader that the department concerned itself and it was not under my control and was egged on by Moscow. I found this grisly comedy very dangerous, as a Jew, of course. He insisted that this is putting it mildly to say the least. Mr. Wolf was found guilty of treason in 1993, and though his conviction was later quashed when the Federal Constitutional Court exempted Stasi spies from prosecution, his present denials were very unconvincing. From the Hitler-Stalin Pact to General Wolf's sponsorship of neo-Nazi thugs, anti-fascism proved to be merely the biggest communist and one of the many communist lies of the last half-century. Shocking that this discovery seemed, if not only surprised by many Germans, who were now accustomed to stories about the Stasi's dirty tricks. We should, however, pay attention to the specters of the past and not just look at it as, well, I can't even say like a one-dimensional view because they literally sponsored neo-Nazi groups. So, if only for the way it was, and it would illuminate the present eruption of neo-Nazi violence in Germany at this point and the far-right rise in Europe, it is really depressing in the really depressed regions of the East, which have not really fully reunited with the West, even though legally they have. The left is still unacknowledged of the fact of the political life that the communists and Nazis are harsh to theory. The Faustian Pact of the East German state made with the repression of nationalism and anti-Semitism bequested a legacy which others have to pay for to this day. Long after the old men have departed the stage, and Hanukkah and all of those, and even the purple witch of the East have died, metropolitans and other areas, especially in the countryside of the Germany, and of course East Germany, still boil with the blood of foreigners and Jews getting in and stealing Mergerb. So, I'm not here to blame the Stasi, but Cold War competition did make for some interesting bedfellows. And with that, for these Stasi spy masters who were more Leninist than the Kremlin themselves and were kind of more Hitler than Hitler themselves, nobody did more to revive the ideology of the Third Reich and the communists. Nobody really did more to revive the disgusting ideology of the Third Reich than the communist supermen who thought that they were the Ubermensch of socialism and their subversion would justify any means possible. Anyway guys, thank you. See you later. Enjoy and learn something, or you'll be sent to the women's detention center. Goodbye.